Welcome to the second half of the Joe Walsh Show. We begin with a look at that Mexican election and what it means for this country and our border. And then a story you might have missed. Millennials are falling in love with socialism. That's not good, but we end with good news, and it comes courtesy of our men and women of the FBI. But first, a major election for president in Mexico this weekend, and a major landslide victory by Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador. To discuss this election and what it means, happy to be joined by David Gantz with the Baker Institute down at Rice University. He's also a law professor. David, thank you. I appreciate you taking some time. This guy won a huge, almost a landslide victory. 53% of the vote. I think the next closest candidate garnered about 22% of the vote in a multi-party race. That's a huge win, isn't it?
I think it's very impressive, even though it's been predicted for quite a long time, because there's a great deal of built-up frustration among Mexican citizens, particularly among relating to crime issues. To differences in income distribution, and more than anything else, to corruption.
Who is he, David? For American audiences, how would you describe this new president of Mexico?
He's been described over the years many, many times as a populist and a radical, but my view is that is probably inaccurate. I think probably the most important aspect of his past is not the fact that he ran for election on much more extreme platforms a few times before, but that he was a very pragmatic mayor of Mexico City for a number of years. So I think he clearly is much more liberal, populist oriented than Mexican presidential administrations have been in the last 30 years. But I'm not one of those who thinks this is like Venezuela or Argentina. I think it's more like Brazil and Lula da Silva, who was also a populist, but turned out to be a very stable influence, at least before he was indicted a few months ago in Brazil.
So, David, this notion that we've heard often in the past day and a half that Mexico elected a socialist, you don't think that's necessarily accurate?
Well, first of all, I'm never entirely sure what that means, since we had a Democratic socialist candidate last year, 2 years ago in the election, and we just had a very young and very attractive candidate who calls herself a socialist elected in one of the elections in New York a couple of weeks ago. But yes, he's been called a socialist, and I suppose that means he would spend more money trying to bring up the least fortunate of the Mexican population.
So, David, how would you explain then his victory? What was churning in Mexico to the point where 53% of the vote said, I've got to be behind this guy?
I think it's mostly frustration with a lack of progress and the high levels of corruption in the other two major parties, the PRI and the PRD. There simply was no longer any faith in those parties, and the PRI, which had governed Mexico for most of the last 90 years, simply lost all their credibility.
And is that
very attractive to a lot of people?
Is there, David, was there any sort of a policy initiative that you saw that he ran on that attracted support necessarily?
Yes, basically get rid of corruption and reduce crime, and both of those, of course, are related to the drug trade. That those were the big issues, not NAFTA, not the U.S., not a lot of other things. It was those two issues that really carried him to victory, in my opinion.
Now, I've noticed that he's taken a couple shots at Trump in the past. President Trump congratulated him, and Mexico's new president sent back kind words toward Trump. Not that any of that matters. Their relationship, the relationship between these two leaders, what are you looking for?
I would hope that the kind words, as you say, you put it, that we heard today, will prevail in time. Keep in mind that he doesn't take office as president until December 1, but I think both he and Mr. Trump seem to recognize that the U.S. and Mexico have a relationship, whether or not they really want it, and there are benefits to both countries to making it a cordial relationship.
How could this, David, what I've been hearing from listeners, what listeners have been wondering all day is, how could this change the United States' relationship with Mexico? What would you anticipate there?
I think it depends on the issues you're talking about. I mean, for the U.S., the big issues today are immigration, obviously, mostly immigration from Central America that passes through Mexico, and the NAFTA renegotiation and some related issues of that sort. And in terms of immigration, if the new administration is cooperative, and maybe even if they can improve their interdiction of immigrants coming across their southern border, I think probably the Trump administration will be very pleased. I think with regard to NAFTA, nobody really knows what's going to happen next, but López Obrador essentially has said he approves of the approach that the current administration has been taking.
Hey, David, in general, how does Mexico respond generally to this whole notion in America of, we elected President Trump, we're finally going to get tough on the border, we're going to build the wall and all of that? How generally does Mexico react to all of that?
Well, of course, they've reacted very, very negatively to some of the rhetoric that has come out of the White House. I think the basic issues of immigration have been with the U.S. and Mexico as a major issue for several decades, or if not much longer. So I don't think there's been as much of an issue of the actual policies, although there's been a lot of criticism of the separation of families, which, of course, has been criticized heavily in the U.S. as well. I think it's more a question of some of the invective and the accusing Mexicans of being rapists and killers and all of that kind of ridiculous stuff.
David, where does Mexico's corruption problem come from?
There are others who probably could give you a better answer than I can, but my impression is that it goes from the top on down, from the presidential level in many administrations down to the policeman on the beat and the customs official at the border. It's just rampant. And part of it, obviously, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, have you seen it do you believe it's gotten worse over the past 5 to 10 to 15 years? I think
my guess, and it's just a guess, an educated guess, is that it's just become more visible because of the usual, it's much harder to hide than it was before we had all these internet-based communications facilities that everybody uses today.
And the drug cartels, David, the crime, the drug cartels, that seems to be a growing issue, no?
I don't know whether it's growing or it's more visible, or just particularly in an election year, you see more evidence of it. I mean, dozens, if not hundreds, of local officials have been murdered in the last 6 months. And I think there are other questions of how complicit at various levels of government, the state, particularly state and local officials, have been. So I suspect in some places it's worse. I mean, it seems to be better in places like Ciudad Juarez and Tijuana, but there are other parts of the country where that doesn't seem to be the case, where it seems to be getting even more serious.
Yeah. Hey, David, last question for you. Are you hopeful with Obrador's election?
I am cautiously optimistic, to use an overused term. I think I'm hoping that he will try to manage his presidency the way he managed his mayorship of Mexico City, which I think most observers would say was pragmatic and sensible. Whether he can do that, he's under an enormous amount of pressure to deliver on issues like dealing with crime, dealing with drugs, dealing with corruption. And I think many Mexicans probably have expectations that are going to be very difficult to meet not only in the short term, but even in 3 or 6 years. But if it looks like he's making progress, and I think he will make a sincere effort to do that, then overall he could be a success.
David Gantz. Hey, David, I really appreciate it. Thank you. Millennials are falling in love with socialism. We'll talk about that next.